The scream came from the east corridor before the sun had even risen. Evelyn Hartley dropped the teacup she was holding, and it shattered against the marble floor of Ashford Manor. She did not stop to look at the broken pieces. She ran, her bare feet cold against the stone, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her own ears. A maid named Grace stood frozen outside the old study, her hands pressed against her mouth. Smoke curled out from under the door in thin gray ribbons. "Fire," Grace whispered, then screamed it again, louder this time, until footsteps thundered from every direction. Evelyn pushed past her and threw open the door. Flames were already climbing the curtains, eating through old velvet like hungry animals. Papers on the desk curled and blackened. And there, standing near the window with his back to her, was her husband, Duke Alexander Ashford, staring at the fire, as if he could not decide whether to save the room or let it burn.
"Alexander!"
Evelyn shouted his name for the first time in weeks. Usually, she called him nothing at all, because he was rarely in the same room long enough to be spoken to. He turned. For one strange moment, his cold gray eyes actually looked at her, truly looked, the way a man looks at someone he has forgotten was still living in his house. "Get out," he said. His voice was flat, controlled, as it always was. "This is not your concern." "The whole house could burn," she said, refusing to move. Servants rushed in behind her with buckets and wet cloths, and within a few frantic minutes, the fire was smothered into black smoke and ruin. When it was over, the study smelled of ash and old secrets. Alexander stood very still, staring at a small burned box that had fallen from a hidden shelf behind the bookcase, its metal corners twisted from the heat. Evelyn saw the way his jaw tightened when he looked at it. She saw something in his face that was rare for him, fear, quickly hidden. "What was in that box?" she asked quietly. "Nothing that concerns a wife who does not know her place," he said, and walked past her without another word, leaving her standing in the ruined study, surrounded by servants who would not meet her eyes. That was how most days began and ended in Ashford Manor. Evelyn had been the Duchess of Ashford for 3 years, yet she still felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. She dined alone at a table built for 20. She slept in a bedroom at the far end of the west wing, while her husband kept to his own chambers in the north tower, a distance of nearly 100 paces and, it seemed, an entire universe. She had married Alexander not for love, but because her father, a minor lord drowning in debt, had arranged the match with the powerful Ashford family. She had been 18, hopeful despite everything, imagining that perhaps kindness could grow where love had not yet been planted. She had been wrong. Alexander was polite in public and silent in private. He attended balls with her arm looped through his, smiled when required, and then returned home, to vanish into his study, or his horses, or whatever cold thing kept him busy until the early hours of the morning. She had tried, in the beginning. She had asked him questions about his day. She had left him notes. She had once waited 3 hours in the dining hall with his favorite meal getting cold, only for a servant to inform her that the Duke had already eaten in his study and would not be joining her. After the first year, she stopped trying. After the second year, she stopped hoping. By the third year, she had become what the staff quietly called, when they thought she could not hear, the invisible Duchess. The morning after the fire, Evelyn walked through the garden alone, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the autumn chill. The estate gardens were the only place in the manor where she felt she could breathe. Roses climbed along stone walls that had stood for centuries, and a small pond reflected the pale morning sky like a mirror someone had forgotten to clean. She was so lost in her thoughts that she nearly walked into the man setting up sketching tools near the eastern wing. "Forgive me," she said quickly, stepping back. The man turned around, startled, then smiled in a way that made her pause. It was not the practiced smile of court, not the careful smile of servants who feared saying the wrong thing to a duchess. It was simple and warm, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long winter. "No, forgive me," he said. "I did not expect anyone to be out here so early. I am Julian Reyes. I have been hired to survey the damage to the eastern wing and plan its restoration." "Evelyn," she said, then hesitated, unsure whether to give her title. Something about his easy manner made her want, just for a moment, to be simply Evelyn and nothing more. If he recognized her name, he did not show it. He gestured toward his sketchbook, which was filled with careful drawings of stone archways and broken windows. "This part of the manor is beautiful," he said. "Neglected, but beautiful. It reminds me of a person who has been overlooked for too long, yet still has so much to offer, if someone would only take the time to notice." Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest, an ache she could not name. "Some things," she said softly, "are neglected for a reason." Julian studied her for a moment, his brown eyes thoughtful rather than prying. "Perhaps," he said. Or, perhaps the people around them simply stopped looking closely enough. She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. But she did not leave either. They stood together for a while in comfortable silence, watching the mist lift off the pond, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn did not feel entirely alone. Word of the fire spread through Ashford Manor like the smoke itself, curling into every room, every whispered conversation among the staff. No one seemed to know what had truly happened, only that the Duke had been in his study before dawn, that something in the old bookcase had caught flame, and that a strange metal box had survived the fire while so much paper had burned to nothing. Mrs. Whitfield, the head housekeeper, was the only servant who had worked at Ashford Manor long enough to remember the Duke as a boy. She found Evelyn later that morning in the drawing room, staring blankly out the window. "You should not trouble yourself over it, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said gently, setting down a tray of tea Evelyn had not asked for, but was grateful for nonetheless. "I am not troubled," Evelyn said, though her tone betrayed her. Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, then sat down across from her, an unusual familiarity for a housekeeper, but the older woman had never quite followed all the rules of formality when it came to kindness. "The Duke was not always this way," she said quietly. "Before you came, before even his father passed, he used to laugh. He used to ride out into the fields, just to feel the wind, not because duty required it. Something changed him. I do not know all of it, only pieces. A woman, a great sorrow, and then silence. He built walls after that, Your Grace. Walls so high I fear even he has forgotten there is a man still living behind them." Evelyn turned to look at her. "Do you think I could ever reach him?" Mrs. Whitfield's eyes softened with something like pity. "I think, my dear, that a man who has forgotten how to be loved must first be reminded that he is worth loving, and I fear his lordship has convinced himself otherwise." The words stayed with Evelyn long after the housekeeper left the room. She thought of Alexander's face in the burning study, the fear he had tried so hard to hide. She thought of the box, twisted and blackened, and wondered what memory could be so painful that a man would rather let his own house burn than have anyone see what he was protecting. That evening, Evelyn dressed for dinner, as she always did, though she knew there was a strong chance she would eat alone again. She sat at the long table, the candles flickering against polished silver, and waited. 20 minutes passed. 30. She was about to signal for the meal to be cleared when the door opened. Alexander stood there, still dressed in his riding clothes, dust on his boots, his dark hair disheveled from the wind. He looked, for a moment, almost startled to find her still sitting there. "You waited," he said, as if the concept itself confused him. "I always wait," Evelyn replied, her voice carefully even. "You have simply never noticed." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. He walked to the table and sat down at the opposite end, the distance between them stretching like an uncrossable field. "The box that survived the fire," she said, unable to stop herself. "What was inside it?" His hand tightened around his wineglass. "That is not your concern. Everything in this house is my concern," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I am your wife." "In name," he said coldly, then seemed to hear his own words and regretted them, though he did not take them back. Evelyn stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "Yes," she said quietly, "in name, because that is all you have ever allowed me to be." She left the dining hall before he could see the tears gathering in her eyes, walking quickly through the corridors until she reached the gardens, the one place that still felt like it belonged to her. The night air was cold, but she did not feel it. She sat on the stone bench near the pond and let herself cry, quietly, the way she had learned to do so no one would hear. She did not notice, at first, that she was not alone. Julian Reyes stood a respectful distance away, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, clearly unsure whether to approach or retreat. When she finally looked up and saw him, She quickly wiped her face, embarrassed. "I am sorry," he said softly. "I was finishing measurements before the light disappeared entirely. I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding," Evelyn said, her voice still thick. "I think I am simply tired of pretending everything is fine." Julian hesitated, then, with her silent permission, sat down at the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful space between them. "You do not have to pretend with me," he said. "I am merely the man fixing broken stones. I have no expectations of you, Your Grace, and no stake in the games of this house." Something about the simplicity of that, the honesty of it, loosened something tight in her chest. "Please," she said, "call me Evelyn, just Evelyn. For a moment, I would like to be only that." He smiled again, that same warm, uncomplicated smile from the morning. "Evelyn, then," he said, "tell me something true. Anything at all. It does not have to be important." She thought for a moment, looking at the dark water of the pond. "I always wanted to see the sea," she said finally. "I have never left this county in my entire life. I read about oceans in books and imagine what it must feel like, standing somewhere that has no walls at all." "Then you should see it," Julian said simply, as though it were the easiest thing in the world. "It is not so simple for someone like me." "Perhaps not," he agreed, "but it is not impossible either. Sometimes, the things we believe are locked away forever, only need someone to remind us that doors still exist." They talked for a while longer, about small things, gardens and books, and the strange shapes clouds made at sunset. Nothing of consequence. Yet Evelyn felt lighter than she had in years. When she finally returned to her cold, empty bedroom that night, she found herself smiling for reasons she did not fully understand. She did not know that, from the window of the North Tower, Alexander had been watching the garden the entire time. His hand pressed flat against the cold glass, his expression unreadable, something dark and unfamiliar twisting quietly in his chest. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he did not care. But long after the candles in his study burned low, he found himself staring again at the twisted metal box from the fire, turning it over in his hands, and for the first time in years, he wondered if the walls he had built around himself had cost him something he could not afford to lose. 3 weeks passed, and the eastern wing of Ashford Manor slowly began to change under Julian's careful direction. Scaffolding rose against blackened stone. Broken windows were measured for new glass. Workers moved through the old corridors with a kind of purpose the manor had not seen in years, and Evelyn found herself drawn there almost every day, watching the transformation with quiet fascination. She told herself she came for the work itself, for the pleasure of watching something ruined become whole again. She did not admit, even to herself, that she came because Julian was there, and because his presence made the long hours of her days feel shorter. "You have a good eye," Julian told her one afternoon, as she stood beside him, studying a set of drawings spread across a wooden table. "Most people looking at this wing see only ruin. You see what it could become." "I have had a great deal of practice imagining better things," Evelyn said, a faint smile touching her lips. "It is easier to dream about stone than about people, I find. Stone does not disappoint you." Julian glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Has someone disappointed you so greatly, Evelyn?" She looked away, toward the tall windows where autumn light spilled across the dusty floor. "It does not matter," she said. "I did not come here to speak of my troubles." "You do not have to," Julian said gently. "But if you ever wish to, I am willing to listen. Sometimes the weight of carrying something alone is heavier than the thing itself." She turned back to him, surprised by the simple kindness in his voice. No one had spoken to her that way in years, not even her own family before her marriage. She had grown so used to silence that his words felt almost foreign, like a language she had forgotten how to understand. Over the following days, small moments accumulated between them, quiet and harmless on their own, but together forming something neither of them named aloud. Julian remembered that she preferred her tea without sugar. He brought her a book of poetry after she mentioned, only once, that she loved verses about the sea. He asked about her opinions on the restoration, and genuinely listened to her answers, adjusting his plans based on what she said, as though her thoughts carried real weight. "You have given the library a proper reading nook," she said one morning, delighted, as she examined a new alcove built beneath a restored window. "I did not expect you to remember that detail." "I remember most things you tell me," Julian said simply. You are not the kind of person whose words are easily forgotten, even if others in this house seem to manage it. Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she was not entirely sure if it was embarrassment or something else entirely. You should be careful, Mr. Reyes, she said, trying to sound light. A duchess, unused to kindness, might grow far too fond of it. Then perhaps, Julian said, his voice quiet but sincere, she deserves a great deal more of it than she has been given. The words settled somewhere deep inside her, and she did not know how to respond, so she simply smiled and changed the subject, though the warmth of his words stayed with her long after she left the eastern wing that day. Meanwhile, life in the rest of Ashford Manor continued its familiar cold rhythm. Alexander spent long hours away from the house, riding out to inspect distant fields, or locking himself in his study, with papers that never seemed to end. He rarely spoke more than a few words to Evelyn, and when he did, his tone remained careful, distant, as though he were speaking to a stranger he was obligated to be polite to, rather than a wife he had promised to cherish. Yet something had shifted since the night of the fire, subtle but undeniable. Alexander found his gaze drifting toward the eastern wing, more often than he cared to admit. He told himself it was simply concern over the restoration work, over the cost of materials and the pace of progress. He did not allow himself to consider that it might be something else, something that had nothing to do with stone or scaffolding at all. One evening, returning from the stables later than usual, he passed near the garden and heard laughter, soft and genuine, drifting through the cool air. He stopped, unseen in the shadows, and saw Evelyn seated on the stone bench beside the pond, Julian beside her, both of them smiling over something Julian had apparently said. Alexander did not know why the sight struck him the way it did. It was innocent enough, two people speaking pleasantly in a garden. Yet something tightened in his chest, sharp and unfamiliar, an emotion he could not immediately name because he had spent so many years refusing to feel much of anything at all. He told himself it was simply propriety. A duchess should not be seen laughing so freely with a hired architect, regardless of how harmless the conversation appeared. That was the explanation he gave himself, as he turned and walked back toward the house, his jaw tight, his footsteps heavier than usual against the gravel path. He did not examine, that night or for several nights after, why the sound of his wife's laughter, a sound he realized he had not heard, directed at him in longer than he could remember, had unsettled him so deeply. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained unaware of what Alexander had seen. Her days had taken on a new shape, brighter at the edges, filled with small moments she found herself looking forward to. She began sketching alongside Julian sometimes, clumsy attempts at drawing the gardens she loved so much, and he never once mocked her efforts, only offered gentle suggestions and genuine encouragement. "You have real talent," he told her one afternoon, examining a sketch she had made of the rose trellis near the eastern wall. "You simply need more confidence in your own hand." "I have not had much reason to be confident in anything for a long while," Evelyn admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. Julian set down his pencil and looked at her directly, his brown eyes steady and warm. "Then allow me to say it plainly. You are clever, thoughtful, and far more resilient than you give yourself credit for. Any man fortunate enough to have your attention should consider himself deeply lucky." Evelyn's breath caught slightly at the sincerity in his voice. She looked down at her sketch, unable to meet his gaze, her heart beating a little faster than she wished to admit. "You should not say such things, Mr. Reyes," she said softly. "It is not proper." "Perhaps not," Julian agreed. "But it is true, and I find I would rather speak truth to you than empty courtesy, even if propriety would prefer otherwise." She did not respond, but she did not ask him to stop either, and the silence between them, comfortable and warm, said more than either of them was willing to voice aloud. That night, as Evelyn prepared for bed, Mrs. Whitfield came to help her undress, as she often did, and Evelyn found herself humming softly, a habit she had not indulged in for years. "You seem lighter these days, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield observed carefully, folding a shawl over the back of a chair. "Do I?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew the answer. "You do," the housekeeper said. "It is good to see. Though I would advise caution, my dear. Light can attract attention, sometimes from directions we do not expect." Evelyn considered the older woman's words, wondering if she was simply speaking of household gossip or something deeper. "I have done nothing improper," she said quietly. I have only spoken with a kind man, about ordinary things. I do not doubt your intentions, Mrs. Whitfield said gently. But intentions and perceptions are not always the same thing, in a house like this one. Be careful, Your Grace. Not because you have done wrong, but because this house has eyes in every corner, and hearts here are more fragile than they appear. Evelyn thought of Alexander's cold, distant expression at dinner earlier that week, the way he had barely glanced at her before retreating to his study.
I do not believe anyone in this house has a heart fragile enough to notice, Mrs. Whitfield, she said, a touch of bitterness creeping into her voice despite herself.
Mrs. Whitfield said nothing more, but her expression carried a quiet knowledge that Evelyn did not yet understand, a suspicion that perhaps the Duke noticed far more than he ever allowed himself to show. The following morning, Evelyn woke to find a small bundle of wildflowers left outside her bedroom door, tied with a simple ribbon, no note attached. She assumed, with a small flutter of pleasure, that Julian had left them, perhaps as a quiet gesture of the friendship growing between them. She did not know that Alexander had been standing outside her door only an hour earlier, the flowers gathered clumsily from the eastern meadow during his early morning ride, an impulse he barely understood himself, born from some deep, buried part of him that remembered, faintly, what it once felt like to want to make someone smile. He had left them without a word, then walked away quickly, embarrassed by his own uncharacteristic tenderness, telling himself it meant nothing, that it was simply the act of a man doing his duty as a husband, nothing more. But when he passed Evelyn later that day, and saw her smiling faintly to herself, the flowers tucked carefully into a small vase in the hallway, he found he could not look away from her expression, and something in his chest ached in a way he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. He did not correct her assumption about who had left the flowers. He told himself it did not matter who she believed had given them. He told himself many things that week, most of which he did not fully believe, and all of which circled back to the same uncomfortable truth he refused to name. He was, despite every wall he had built, beginning to notice his wife again. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, when Evelyn decided to walk to the eastern wing anyway, wrapped tightly in a heavy cloak, her boots sinking slightly into the soaked gravel path. She told herself she wanted to check on the progress of the restoration, though a quieter voice inside her admitted she simply wanted to see Julian. The workers had left early that day, driven indoors by the worsening storm, and when Evelyn stepped into the covered garden pavilion near the eastern wing to escape the sudden downpour, she found Julian already there, shaking water from his coat, his dark hair damp against his forehead. "You should not be out in this weather," he said, though his tone carried more concern than reprimand. "Neither should you," Evelyn replied, a small smile tugging at her lips, despite the chill settling into her bones. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, and the rain intensified, hammering against the pavilion roof in a steady, relentless rhythm. Julian gestured toward a wooden bench pushed against the far wall, sheltered from the worst of the wind, and they sat together, watching the storm through the open archway. "It seems we are trapped here for a while," Julian said, a note of amusement in his voice. "There are worse places to be trapped," Evelyn admitted quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of rain filling the space between them, before Julian spoke again, his voice gentler than before. "You have seemed troubled lately, Evelyn. Despite your smiles, I do not wish to intrude where I am not welcome, but I find myself concerned for you." Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the gray curtain of rain. "It is nothing new," she said softly. "Only the same loneliness I have carried for 3 years. I suppose I have simply grown tired of pretending it does not weigh on me." "You do not have to pretend with me," Julian reminded her gently. "You never have." She turned to look at him, and something in his steady gaze made the words spill out of her before she could stop them. "I do not know how to keep living this way," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "Married to a man who looks through me as though I am made of glass. I have tried everything I know to reach him, and each time I am met with silence, with cold distance, until I no longer recognize the hopeful girl I once was. I feel invisible in my own home, Julian. I feel as though I have disappeared, and no one has noticed I am gone." Her eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back, and Julian, without hesitation, reached over and gently took her hand in his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles in a gesture meant only to comfort. "You are not invisible to me," he said quietly, his voice thick with sincerity. "I see you clearly, Evelyn. I have seen you since the very first morning we met in the garden. I see your kindness, your intelligence, the quiet strength it takes for you to keep enduring what you endure. Any man who fails to see those things in you is a fool, however powerful his title may be." Evelyn's breath caught, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the rain continuing to fall around them, the world outside the pavilion feeling impossibly far away. "You should not say such things to me," she whispered, though she made no move to pull her hand away. "Perhaps not," Julian admitted. "But I find, more and more, that I care for you deeply, Evelyn, not as a duchess, not as another man's wife, but as the woman I have come to know these past weeks. I do not say this to cause you harm, or to ask anything improper of you. I say it only because I believe you deserve to hear that someone sees your worth clearly, without condition." Tears slipped freely down her cheeks now, and she found herself unable to look away from him, caught in the quiet, unguarded honesty of his expression. "I have not felt cared for in so long," she admitted. "I had almost forgotten what it felt like." "Then let this be a reminder," Julian said softly, "that you are worthy of care, Evelyn. Whatever happens between us, whatever the future holds, you must never again believe that you are invisible." They remained there together, as the storm slowly began to ease, their hands still lightly clasped, nothing improper passing between them, beyond words and comfort. Yet the emotional closeness of the moment was undeniable, a bond quietly forming, that neither of them fully understood the weight of yet. What neither of them realized was that Alexander, having ridden back early from a delayed meeting with a neighboring landholder, had taken shelter from the storm beneath the overhang of the old stable, directly across the courtyard from the garden pavilion. Through the sheets of rain, he could see two figures seated closely together, hands joined, heads bent toward one another in quiet, intimate conversation. He could not hear their words. He did not need to. The image alone struck him with a force he was entirely unprepared for, a sharp, twisting sensation in his chest that he might have once called jealousy, had he allowed himself the honesty to name it so plainly. He stood frozen beneath the stable overhang for a long moment, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, watching his wife lean toward another man, with an openness she had never once shown him in 3 years of marriage. He told himself it should not matter. He told himself, repeatedly, that he had no claim to her heart, having never once tried to earn it. Yet the sight of her tears, of Julian's tender concern, of the gentle way the architect held her hand, as though she were something precious and fragile, cut through him more deeply than he could have anticipated. For the first time since the fire, Alexander felt the full weight of what he had allowed to happen in his own home, in his own marriage, through years of cold silence and deliberate distance. He turned away before either of them could notice him, walking quickly back toward the manor, through the thinning rain, his thoughts a chaotic storm of their own. He did not go to his study that evening. Instead, he found himself standing outside Evelyn's bedroom door for a long while, his hand raised as though to knock, before finally letting it fall back to his side, unable to find the words he needed, uncertain if he even deserved to speak them. Later that night, unable to sleep, he retrieved the small burned box from his desk drawer, the one that had survived the fire in his study. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of old letters, yellowed with age, tied together with a faded ribbon. He did not read them again that night. He had read them too many times already, memorized every painful word. They were letters from Isabel, the woman he had loved before his marriage to Evelyn, the woman whose betrayal had taught him that love was a doorway to devastation, that trust was a currency, too easily spent and rarely repaid. He had built every wall in his life around the lessons those letters had taught him, and he had, without ever truly meaning to, imprisoned Evelyn behind those same walls, punishing her for wounds she had never caused. Watching her in the garden with Julian, seeing the tenderness she had never been permitted to receive from him, Alexander understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he stood at real risk of losing the one thing he had never realized he still wanted, simply because he had been too afraid to reach for it. He closed the box slowly, his hands trembling slightly, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to consider the possibility that his own coldness, and not his wife's shortcomings, had been the true failure of his marriage all along. The Dowager Duchess Margaret arrived at Ashford Manor without warning, on a cold Tuesday morning, her carriage rattling up the long drive just as the household finished breakfast. She was a sharp-eyed woman, elegant despite her age, with a voice that carried the same commanding weight her sons once had, before grief had hollowed it into silence. "I have heard troubling things," she announced, before she had even removed her traveling gloves, seating herself in the drawing room as though she still owned it, which in many practical ways she still did. Alexander stood near the window, his arms folded, his expression carefully neutral. "Mother, whatever gossip has reached you, I assure you it is exaggerated." "Is it?" Margaret asked, arching one thin eyebrow. "I hear that your wife spends her afternoons in the company of the architect you hired, laughing in gardens, exchanging gifts of books and flowers, while you remain locked away in your study, as though your own marriage were a business arrangement you have long since forgotten to honor." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Evelyn has done nothing improper." "I did not say she had," Margaret replied evenly. "I said you have given her every reason to seek warmth elsewhere, because you have offered her none yourself. A woman starved of affection will eventually turn toward whatever kindness she is offered, Alexander, and I would not blame her for it, however much it might wound your pride to hear me say so." Alexander turned away from her, staring out at the gray autumn sky beyond the window. "You know why I have kept my distance," he said quietly. "You know what happened before. I know Isabel broke your heart and taught you to distrust every tender feeling you have ever had since," Margaret said, her voice softening slightly. "But your wife is not Isabel, Alexander. Evelyn has done nothing but endure your coldness with more patience than you deserve, and I fear, if you do not act soon, you will lose her entirely to a man who has done nothing but offer her the simple decency you have withheld." Her words settled into him like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through thoughts he had spent years trying to keep calm and undisturbed. He did not respond, but his silence carried its own answer, an acknowledgement he was not yet ready to speak aloud. Later that day, unable to shake his mother's words, Alexander found himself walking toward the eastern wing, for the first time since the restoration had begun, ostensibly to inspect the progress of the work, though he knew, in the honest corners of his mind, that he was searching for something else entirely. He found Evelyn there, examining a set of restored windows with quiet admiration, sunlight catching the fine lines of her face in a way he had not allowed himself to notice in a very long time. She looked up as he approached, surprise flickering across her expression. "Alexander," she said carefully, "I did not expect to see you here." "I wish to see the progress of the restoration myself," he said, though his eyes lingered on her rather than the windows behind her. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with 3 years of accumulated distance neither of them quite knew how to cross. Finally, Alexander spoke again, his voice quieter than usual. "The eastern wing looks well," he said. "Reyes has done fine work." "He has," Evelyn agreed, a note of warmth entering her voice that she did not attempt to hide. The warmth in her tone struck Alexander harder than he expected, and he found himself asking, before he could stop the words, "Do you care for him?" Evelyn's eyes widened slightly at the directness of the question, the first genuine curiosity he had shown toward her feelings in longer than she could remember. "Why do you ask?" she said carefully. "You have never once asked what I feel about anything." "Perhaps I am asking now," Alexander said, his voice low, something unfamiliar flickering behind his usually guarded eyes. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, searching his face for whatever had prompted this sudden, uncharacteristic interest. "Julian has been kind to me," she said honestly. "Kinder than anyone in this house has been in 3 years. I will not apologize for accepting kindness where I have found it, Alexander, especially when you have offered so little of your own." The words struck him like a physical blow, precisely because he knew them to be true. He opened his mouth to respond, uncertain even himself what he intended to say, when a servant appeared in the doorway to inform him urgently that a matter regarding the estate's finances required his immediate attention. Alexander hesitated, torn between duty and the fragile, unfamiliar thread of conversation he had only just begun to weave with his wife. In the end, old habits won, as they always had, and he excused himself, leaving Evelyn standing alone amid the restored windows, watching him go with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that almost resembled hope. That evening, Word reached Evelyn through Mrs. Whitfield that the Dowager Duchess had arrived and had spoken privately with Alexander for a considerable time. Evelyn wondered, with a flicker of unease, what exactly had been said, and whether her own growing friendship with Julian had become the subject of household gossip more widely than she had realized. She sought out Julian later that evening, in the quiet of the library, finding him seated near the newly restored reading nook, a book open on his lap though his attention seemed elsewhere. "Is something troubling you?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. Julian looked up, his expression more serious than usual. "I have heard whispers among the staff," he admitted, "concerns about propriety, about the time we have spent together. I would not wish to bring scandal upon you, Evelyn, or complications to your marriage, however strained it may already be." Evelyn felt a small pang of fear at his words, though she tried to keep her voice steady. "Do you regret our friendship?" "Never," Julian said firmly, leaning forward slightly. "I only worry for your sake, not my own. I have grown to care for you a great deal, Evelyn, more than I perhaps should, given your circumstances. I do not wish that care to cause you harm." "You have brought me nothing but comfort," Evelyn said softly. "I will not regret that, whatever anyone else chooses to whisper." Julian studied her for a long moment, something conflicted passing behind his warm brown eyes. "I only hope," he said quietly, "that in caring for you, I have not made your situation more difficult than it already was." Evelyn reached out and gently touched his hand, a small gesture of reassurance. "You have made my situation more bearable," she said. "That is a gift I will not easily forget, regardless of what whispers may follow." Neither of them noticed Alexander standing just beyond the library door, having come to seek Evelyn out after his conversation with his mother, intending, for the first time in years, to attempt some clumsy gesture of reconciliation. He froze at the sight of her hand resting gently over Julian's, the quiet intimacy of the moment stopping him in his tracks. He did not enter the library. He turned and walked away instead, his chest tight with an emotion he could no longer deny was jealousy, sharp and unfamiliar, and entirely unwelcome. For the first time since Isabel's betrayal years ago, Alexander felt the frightening, undeniable pull of caring deeply for someone, and the terrifying possibility that he had already waited too long to admit it. Alexander did not sleep that night. He sat in his study long after the candles burned low, the burned box from the fire open before him, its contents spread across his desk, like fragments of a life he had spent years trying to bury. Isabel's letters, faded and brittle, no longer held the power over him they once had. Instead, his thoughts kept returning to the image of Evelyn's hand resting gently over Julian's, the warmth in her voice when she spoke of him, the ease between them that Alexander had never once managed to create in 3 years of marriage. He thought of his mother's words, sharp and unwelcome, but undeniably true. He thought of Evelyn's own words in the Eastern Wing, her honest admission that Julian had offered her kindness, where Alexander had offered only silence. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully consider what he stood to lose, not through any fault of Evelyn's, but through his own relentless refusal to let go of old wounds that had nothing to do with her. The following morning, Alexander sought Evelyn out before she had even finished dressing, knocking on her bedroom door with a hesitance that surprised even himself. When she opened it, wrapped in a simple morning robe, her surprise at seeing him there was evident. "Alexander," she said carefully. "Is something wrong?" "I would like to speak with you," he said, his voice lacking its usual cold composure. "If you would permit me." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the source of this sudden, uncharacteristic vulnerability, before stepping aside to let him enter. They stood facing each other in the quiet morning light, an unfamiliar tension filling the space between them. "I saw you," Alexander said finally, his voice quiet. "In the library, last night, with Reyes." Evelyn's expression shifted from surprise to something more guarded. "And what did you see exactly?" "Nothing improper," Alexander admitted honestly. "Only kindness, only the ease of two people who have grown comfortable with one another. It was not the sight itself that troubled me, Evelyn. It was the realization that I have never once given you that same ease, that same comfort, in 3 years of marriage." Evelyn's eyes widened slightly at his honesty, so unlike the guarded man she had grown used to. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, despite her attempt at composure. Because I am afraid, Alexander admitted, the words clearly difficult for him to speak aloud. I am afraid that I have wasted 3 years building walls to protect myself from pain, only to cause the very woman I promised to cherish a different kind of suffering entirely. I am afraid I have already lost something I did not realize I still wanted, until I saw it in danger of slipping away. Evelyn's breath caught, uncertain how to respond to this sudden, raw vulnerability from a man who had spent years perfecting the art of emotional distance. You have never spoken to me this way before, she said softly. I know, Alexander said, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like shame. And I know I have no right to expect forgiveness, simply because I have finally noticed my own failures. But I would like the chance, Evelyn, to understand what went wrong between us, and perhaps, if you would permit it, to try to repair some of the damage I have caused. Evelyn studied him carefully, torn between the hope his words stirred and the caution born of 3 years of disappointment. Why now, Alexander? She asked quietly. Why, after all this time, have you suddenly decided to notice me? He was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much honesty he was willing to offer. Because I saw, in Reyes's kindness toward you, everything I failed to give you myself, he admitted finally. And it forced me to confront a truth I have been avoiding for years. I built walls after Isabel's betrayal, walls meant to protect myself from ever being hurt again. But in building those walls, I imprisoned you as well, punishing you for wounds you never caused, denying you the affection and attention you deserved, simply because I was too afraid to risk feeling anything at all. The mention of Isabel's name struck Evelyn with unexpected force. She had heard whispers of the name before, in passing comments from servants. But Alexander had never once spoken of her directly. Who was she? Evelyn asked gently. The woman who hurt you so deeply? Alexander's expression darkened slightly, old pain resurfacing despite his efforts to control it. Isabel was the woman I loved before our marriage was arranged, he said quietly. I believed, foolishly, that she loved me in return. I learned, in the cruelest way possible, that her affections were never genuine, that she had been using our relationship to secure a connection to my family's wealth and influence, planning all along to abandon me the moment a wealthier prospect presented itself. When I discovered her betrayal, something in me broke that I never fully repaired. I convinced myself that love was simply a mechanism for manipulation, that trust was a weakness to be avoided at all costs. I carried those beliefs into our marriage, Evelyn, and I am only now beginning to understand how deeply unfair that was to you. Evelyn absorbed his words slowly, pieces of the puzzle that was her husband finally beginning to fit together. You punished me for her betrayal, she said softly, not accusingly, but with a dawning understanding. Yes, Alexander admitted, his voice heavy with regret. And I am deeply sorry for it, though I know an apology alone cannot undo 3 years of neglect. I do not expect you to simply forgive me, Evelyn. I only ask for the chance to prove, through actions, rather than empty words, that I am capable of being the husband you deserve, if you are willing to give me that chance. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, her heart caught between old wounds and a fragile, unexpected hope. I do not know if I can simply forget 3 years of loneliness, Alexander, she said honestly, but I am willing to listen if you are truly willing to change. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was more than Alexander had dared to hope for only a day earlier, and he found himself grasping at the small opening she had offered him, with a desperation that surprised even himself. Over the following days, Alexander began making small, deliberate efforts, joining Evelyn for meals rather than eating alone in his study, asking genuine questions about her thoughts and interests, offering small gestures of consideration he had neglected for years. Evelyn remained cautious, unwilling to be swept away by sudden attention after so long enduring its absence, but she found herself softening slightly despite her guarded heart, curious about this unfamiliar version of her husband who seemed determined, however clumsily, to finally see her. Julian noticed the change as well, watching quietly from the sidelines as Alexander began, tentatively, to fight for the marriage he had neglected for so long. He said nothing of it directly to Evelyn, though a quiet understanding settled in him that his role in her life might soon need to change, whatever feelings had grown between them during the quiet weeks of the restoration work. None of them yet knew how much further the path ahead would test them, or whether Alexander's newfound efforts would prove genuine enough, sustained enough, to heal the deep wounds 3 years of coldness had carved into his marriage. Isabel Farrow had never intended to return to Ashford Manor again, but circumstances, as they often did, forced her hand. Widowed young and left with dwindling finances after her second marriage had ended in scandal, she arrived at the manor gates one gray afternoon, under the pretense of discussing an old family matter with Alexander, though her true motives ran considerably deeper. Alexander received her in the drawing room with a coldness that surprised even himself, given how deeply her memory had once haunted him. Seeing her now, older and considerably less radiant than the memories he had preserved of her, he felt strangely little beyond a distant, almost clinical curiosity. "You look well, Alexander," Isabel said, settling into a chair with practiced elegance, though her eyes assessed the room with calculating interest. "What do you want, Isabel?" Alexander asked, directly, in no mood for pleasantries. She smiled thinly. "Can an old friend not simply visit?" "We were never friends," Alexander said flatly. "You made that quite clear when you abandoned our engagement for a wealthier suitor. Please, spare us both the pretense, and tell me your true purpose here." Isabel's smile faltered slightly at his directness, clearly having expected a more sentimental reception. "Very well," she said, her tone shifting to something more businesslike. "I find myself in difficult circumstances, and I had hoped, given our history, that you might be willing to offer some assistance. A loan, perhaps, or an introduction to suitable investment opportunities." Alexander studied her for a long moment, recognizing, with a clarity that surprised him, how little power her presence held over him now. The wounds she had once inflicted had scarred over into something manageable, no longer the open, festering injury they had once been. He realized, with something like relief, that his recent efforts toward honesty with Evelyn had already begun loosening the grip Isabel's betrayal had held over his heart for years. "I owe you nothing, Isabel," he said calmly. "You made your choice years ago, and I have built a life since then that does not include accommodating your difficulties. I would ask that you not return to Ashford Manor again." Isabel's expression hardened, any pretense of warmth vanishing entirely. "You have changed," she observed coolly. "The Alexander the new would never have spoken to me so plainly. The Alexander you knew was a naive boy who mistook manipulation for affection," he replied evenly. "I am no longer that boy, and I have no intention of allowing old mistakes to threaten what I am only now beginning to rebuild." Isabel left shortly after, her expression carrying a mixture of anger and grudging respect, and Alexander found himself feeling lighter than he had in years, as though a burden he had carried unknowingly for a very long time had finally been set down. He did not mention Isabel's visit to Evelyn immediately, uncertain how she might react to learning of the woman who had shaped so much of his emotional distance. But that evening, over a quiet dinner that had become a regular occurrence between them over the past week, he found himself confessing the visit anyway, driven by a growing commitment to honesty he had never before prioritized in their marriage. "Isabel came to the manor today," he said, watching Evelyn's expression carefully. Evelyn's fork paused midway to her mouth, surprise flickering across her face. "What did she want?" "Money," Alexander said simply. "And perhaps, I suspect, to remind herself that she still held some power over me. She was disappointed to discover she did not." Evelyn studied him carefully. How did it feel, seeing her again? Alexander considered the question seriously before answering. "Strangely unremarkable," he admitted. "I expected old wounds to resurface, painful memories to overwhelm me, as they once did. Instead, I found myself thinking of you, and of how much more I stand to lose by remaining trapped in old grievances than I ever stood to gain by nursing them." Evelyn's expression softened slightly at his words, though caution remained evident in her eyes. "You are speaking very differently than you once did, Alexander." "I am trying," he said honestly. "I know actions matter more than words, and I know I have given you little reason to trust promises alone. But I wanted you to hear this from me directly, rather than through servant gossip or assumption. I am attempting, clumsily perhaps, to become a husband worthy of your trust." Evelyn set down her fork, studying him with an expression that mixed hope and lingering doubt. "I appreciate your honesty," she said carefully. But 3 years of silence cannot be undone in a single week of kind gestures, Alexander. I want to believe in this change. Truly I do. But I have been disappointed too many times to simply trust it without evidence sustained over time. I understand, Alexander said, and to his credit, he did not argue or attempt to rush her forgiveness. I will not ask you to trust me immediately. I will simply try, each day, to prove myself worthy of that trust, for as long as it takes. Their conversation was interrupted by a servant, announcing that Julian had arrived to discuss the final phase of the Eastern Wing restoration, and Evelyn excused herself to attend the meeting, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts, watching her go with an expression that mixed hope and quiet anxiety. He found himself, in the days that followed, paying closer attention to the dynamic between Evelyn and Julian, not with the possessive jealousy that had once gripped him, but with a growing respect for the architect's evident decency. Julian had done nothing improper, had offered Evelyn only genuine friendship and comfort during a period when Alexander himself had failed to provide either. Whatever resentment Alexander might once have harbored, slowly transformed into a grudging gratitude, recognizing that Julian's kindness had, in its own way, helped illuminate the failures Alexander needed to confront within himself. One afternoon, finding himself alone with Julian, while Evelyn attended to other matters, Alexander made the uncharacteristic decision to speak with him directly, rather than allowing unspoken tensions to fester beneath the surface. "Mr. Reyes," he said, approaching the architect in the Eastern Wing, where he was reviewing final construction details, "I would like a word, if you have a moment." Julian looked up, his expression carefully neutral, clearly uncertain what to expect from the conversation. "Of course, Your Grace." Alexander hesitated, choosing his words with unusual care. "I have not been an attentive husband these past years," he said honestly. "I recognize that my own coldness created the circumstances in which my wife sought comfort from your friendship. I do not resent you for offering her kindness I failed to provide myself. I only wish to thank you, and to be honest about my own intentions going forward." Julian studied him for a long moment, clearly surprised by the directness of the admission. "I have cared for Evelyn's well-being, Your Grace," he said carefully. "Nothing more was ever intended, whatever the appearance might have suggested to others." "I believe you," Alexander said, and found, to his own surprise, that he genuinely did. "I intend to become the husband she deserves, Mr. Reyes, though I know it will take considerable time and effort to earn back what I have neglected for so long. I would ask, if you are willing, that you continue treating her with the same respect and kindness you have shown thus far, as I work to rebuild what I have damaged." Julian nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his expression. "I wish you success in that endeavor, Your Grace," he said sincerely. "Evelyn deserves genuine happiness, whatever form it ultimately takes." The two men parted, with a newfound, if cautious, mutual respect, and Alexander returned to the manor, with a renewed determination to prove, through consistent action rather than empty promise, that he was capable of becoming the husband he had failed to be for far too long. The memory came to Alexander most vividly at night, when the manor grew quiet and his mind, no longer occupied by daily duties, drifted back to the years before Evelyn, before even Isabel, to a childhood that had shaped him more deeply than he often allowed himself to acknowledge. His father, the previous Duke, had been a demanding man, quick to withhold affection as a means of enforcing discipline, teaching young Alexander that vulnerability was a weakness unworthy of a future Duke. Alexander remembered, with painful clarity, the rare moments when his father had shown him warmth, and how those moments had always been followed by disappointment, by lessons that affection was conditional, easily withdrawn, the moment expectations were not met. When Isabel had entered his life during his early 20s, she had represented, for a brief and shining period, an escape from that conditional world. He had believed, with the desperate hope of a young man starved of genuine affection, that her love was unconditional, that with her, he could finally set down the careful guardedness his father had instilled in him. Her betrayal had not simply broken his heart, it had confirmed every fear his father's coldness had planted within him, convincing him absolutely that vulnerability led only to devastation. He understood now, with a clarity that had taken years and considerable pain to achieve, that his coldness toward Evelyn had never truly been about her, It had been about protecting himself from a repetition of pain he had experienced twice already. First from his father, then from Isabel. He had built walls not out of malice, but out of a desperate, misguided attempt at self-preservation, never fully considering the collateral damage those walls would inflict on an innocent woman who had done nothing to deserve his distrust. This understanding, once achieved, did not undo the damage already done, but it clarified for Alexander precisely what he needed to do moving forward. He could not simply will himself to trust easily after years of guardedness, but he could choose, deliberately and repeatedly, to act with kindness and openness despite his fear, allowing trust to be rebuilt through consistent action rather than waiting for fear to disappear entirely before attempting change. He shared some of this understanding with Evelyn during a quiet evening walk through the gardens, the autumn air crisp but not yet bitterly cold, the roses along the stone walls beginning to fade with the changing season. "I have spent years believing that love inevitably leads to betrayal," he admitted, watching the last of the evening light fade over the pond. "My father taught me that affection was conditional, a lesson Isabel later confirmed in the cruelest way possible. I built my entire approach to relationships around avoiding vulnerability, believing it was the only way to protect myself from further pain." Evelyn listened quietly, walking beside him with her arms wrapped loosely around herself against the evening chill. "And now?" she asked softly. "Now I understand that in protecting myself, I inflicted an entirely different kind of pain onto you," Alexander said, his voice heavy with genuine regret. "I punished you for wounds you never caused, denied you affection you deserved, all because I was too afraid to risk feeling anything at all. I am deeply sorry for that, Evelyn, more sorry than I know how to properly express." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Thank you for telling me this," she said finally. "It helps, understanding where your coldness came from, even if it does not entirely erase the loneliness I have carried these past years." "I do not expect it to erase anything," Alexander said honestly. "I only hope, in time, that understanding might allow for healing, if you are willing to continue giving me the chance to earn back your trust." They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer, the weight of his confession settling between them, not entirely resolved but undeniably significant progress toward the honesty their marriage had lacked for so long. "I spoke with my mother again this week," Alexander continued eventually. "She reminded me that Isabel's betrayal was never truly about my own worth, but about her own selfish ambitions. It seems obvious, stated so plainly, yet I had never fully allowed myself to separate her actions from my own sense of self-worth. I had internalized her betrayal as proof that I was fundamentally unlovable, rather than simply unfortunate enough to have loved someone incapable of genuine affection." "You are not unlovable, Alexander," Evelyn said softly, surprising herself with the genuine warmth in her own voice. He looked at her, something vulnerable and hopeful flickering in his expression. "I am trying to believe that," he said quietly. "It is a difficult thing to unlearn, after so many years believing otherwise." Evelyn found herself, in that moment, reaching out and gently taking his hand. The first time she had initiated physical contact between them in longer than she could remember. Alexander's breath caught slightly at the gesture, his fingers closing carefully around hers, as though afraid the moment might shatter if handled too roughly. "I cannot promise you instant forgiveness, or immediate trust," Evelyn said honestly, "but I can promise you that I see your effort, Alexander, and that it means more to me than you perhaps realize." They stood together beside the pond as darkness settled fully over the gardens, hands still gently joined, neither speaking further, the silence between them finally carrying warmth, rather than the cold distance that had defined their marriage for so long. In the days that followed, Alexander continued his efforts with a consistency that gradually began to soften Evelyn's careful guardedness. He joined her for meals without fail, asked genuine questions about her day, remembered small details she mentioned in passing, and slowly began sharing more of his own thoughts and vulnerabilities in return. It was not a swift transformation, nor a perfect one, but it was genuine, sustained, and undeniably real, and Evelyn found herself, despite her lingering caution, beginning to hope that perhaps her marriage might yet become something worth truly believing in. Julian, observing the gradual change from a respectful distance as the Eastern Wing restoration neared completion, recognized that his own role in Evelyn's life was approaching its natural conclusion. He felt no bitterness at this realization, only a quiet satisfaction in having helped illuminate, however unintentionally, the path toward genuine healing within her marriage. The eastern wing was finally completed on a bright, clear morning, in late autumn, sunlight streaming through the newly restored windows in a way that made the entire space feel reborn. Julian stood in the center of the finished library, surveying his work with quiet pride, when Evelyn arrived to see the final result. "It is beautiful," she said, turning slowly to take in the restored archways, the gleaming new woodwork, the reading nook bathed in warm autumn light. "You have given this place a second life, Julian." "It was my privilege," he said, watching her with an expression that carried both genuine happiness and a quiet, bittersweet acknowledgement of what came next. "My work here is finished, Evelyn. I will be leaving Ashford Manor within the week." The news struck her with unexpected weight, a reminder that the comfortable friendship they had built during these past months carried a natural expiration she had perhaps not fully allowed herself to consider. "I will miss our conversations," she said honestly. "As will I," Julian admitted. "You have become someone I care for deeply, Evelyn, in ways I did not entirely anticipate when I first arrived here. But I have watched your husband's efforts these past weeks, and I believe, genuinely, that he is trying to become the man you deserve. I would not wish to complicate that progress by remaining here longer than necessary." Evelyn felt a complicated mixture of emotions at his words. Gratitude for his honesty, mixed with genuine sadness at the prospect of his departure. "You have given me something I did not know I needed," she said softly. "You reminded me that I was worthy of kindness, worthy of being truly seen. I will not forget that, whatever happens next in my marriage." "That is all I ever hoped to give you," Julian said sincerely. "Not romance, though I will not pretend I never considered it, simply the reminder that you deserved better than the isolation you had been living in. I hope, sincerely, that your husband continues proving himself worthy of the trust you are extending him." They shared a final, warm embrace, entirely appropriate and without impropriety, a genuine farewell between two people who had helped each other through a difficult period, without ever crossing the boundaries that would have compromised Evelyn's marriage or Julian's own integrity. Alexander, informed of Julian's impending departure by Mrs. Whitfield, found himself experiencing an unexpected surge of gratitude toward the architect, recognizing fully now the role Julian's simple kindness had played in awakening him to his own failures. He sought Julian out on his final morning at the manor, finding him loading his belongings into a waiting carriage. "Mr. Reyes," Alexander said, approaching with unusual warmth in his expression, "I wanted to thank you properly before you departed." Julian turned, slightly surprised by the sincerity evident in the Duke's demeanor. "There is no need for thanks, Your Grace. I simply did my work and offered friendship where it seemed needed." "You did considerably more than that," Alexander said honestly. "You reminded me, through your example, what genuine kindness looks like. Kindness I had failed to offer my own wife for far too long. I do not know if I would have found the courage to change without witnessing what you offered Evelyn so freely. For that, I owe you a debt I am not certain how to properly repay." Julian studied him for a long moment, genuine respect evident in his expression. "Simply continue what you have begun, Your Grace," he said. "That is repayment enough. Evelyn deserves genuine happiness, and I believe, truly, that you are capable of providing it now." The two men shook hands with a mutual respect that would have seemed impossible only months earlier, and Julian departed Ashford Manor that afternoon, leaving behind a restored eastern wing and a marriage quietly transformed by his brief but meaningful presence. That evening, Alexander found Evelyn in the newly finished library, sitting quietly in the reading nook Julian had designed specifically with her in mind. He approached carefully, uncertain of his welcome, given the bittersweet nature of the day.
"Are you well?"
He asked gently, settling into the chair across from her. "I am," Evelyn said, offering him a small, genuine smile. "I will miss Julian's friendship, but I do not regret the time we spent together. He helped me remember my own worth, during a period when I had nearly forgotten it entirely." "I am grateful to him for that," Alexander said honestly, surprising her slightly with the sincerity of the admission. "I recognize now that his kindness illuminated my own failures more clearly than any argument or confrontation could have managed. I do not resent him, Evelyn. I am simply determined to ensure you never again need to seek elsewhere for the affection and attention you deserve from your own husband." Evelyn studied him carefully, noting the genuine conviction in his expression, so different from the guarded coldness that had once defined him. "You have changed a great deal these past weeks, Alexander," she observed. "I am trying to become worthy of the trust you have begun extending me," he said simply. "I know it will take considerable time to fully earn back what 3 years of neglect has cost us. But I intend to keep trying, every day, for as long as it takes." Evelyn reached out and took his hand, a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them over recent weeks. "I believe you," she said softly, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she genuinely meant it. They sat together in the library as evening settled fully around them, the restored eastern wing finally complete. A new chapter in their marriage, beginning to take shape amid the quiet ruins of what their relationship had once been, rebuilding itself slowly into something neither of them had believed possible only months earlier. Winter arrived at Ashford Manor with its usual quiet severity, frost coating the garden roses that had bloomed so brilliantly only weeks earlier, but within the manor walls, a different kind of warmth had begun steadily replacing the cold distance of previous years. Alexander's efforts, which Evelyn had initially regarded with cautious skepticism, had proven remarkably consistent, sustained not through grand romantic gestures, but through the quiet, daily accumulation of genuine attention and care. He learned her preferences in tea, in books, in the small comforts that made her days easier, remembering these details not through effort alone, but through genuine interest in understanding her fully. He asked about her thoughts on estate matters, valuing her opinions in ways he had never once considered during their first 3 years of marriage. He joined her for breakfast every morning, without exception, a small ritual that had become, over time, one of the most meaningful parts of Evelyn's day. "You seem different lately," Mrs. Whitfield observed one morning, helping Evelyn arrange her hair before breakfast. "Lighter, somehow, in a way I have not seen since your wedding day." "I feel different," Evelyn admitted, studying her own reflection thoughtfully. "I did not believe change was possible, Mrs. Whitfield, not after everything. But Alexander has proven himself these past weeks in ways I did not expect." "I am glad to hear it," the housekeeper said warmly. "This house has needed warmth for far too long. It seems, finally, that warmth has found its way back in." Yet despite the genuine progress, Evelyn found herself still occasionally guarded, unable to fully release the protective walls she had built during 3 years of isolation. She tested Alexander in small ways, watching carefully for signs that his change might prove temporary, that old patterns of neglect might reassert themselves once the novelty of his effort faded. One particularly difficult afternoon, when estate matters demanded considerable attention from Alexander, Evelyn found herself waiting anxiously to see whether he would maintain their new tradition of dining together, despite the pressures of his day. When he arrived at the dinner table, precisely on time, despite clear exhaustion evident in his expression, something in Evelyn's guarded heart finally began to soften more completely. "You did not have to come," she said gently, noting the fatigue in his features. "I would have understood, given the demands on your time today." "I wanted to come," Alexander said simply, settling into his chair across from her. "I promised you consistency, Evelyn, not merely when it proved convenient. I intend to honor that promise, regardless of how demanding my other responsibilities might become." Evelyn felt something warm unfurl in her chest at his words, a growing certainty that his transformation was genuine, sustained not through fleeting inspiration, but through deliberate, consistent choice. "Thank you," she said softly, "for continuing to show up, even when it would have been easier not to." Their conversation that evening turned toward deeper topics than usual, Alexander sharing more openly about his hopes for the estate's future, his concerns about tenant welfare, his desire to leave a legacy different from his own father's harsh, conditional approach to leadership and family alike. Evelyn listened with growing admiration, recognizing in his words a man genuinely committed to becoming better, not simply for appearances, but from authentic internal conviction. "I would like your help," Alexander said unexpectedly, near the end of their meal, "in reviewing the tenant welfare proposals I have been considering. Your perspective, Evelyn, has proven more valuable to me than I once allowed myself to acknowledge. I believe our estate would benefit greatly from your involvement in these decisions, if you are willing to offer it." The invitation, so different from the dismissive silence he had once offered regarding estate matters, struck Evelyn with unexpected emotion. "I would be honored," she said, her voice slightly unsteady with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Alexander, for trusting my judgment in this." "I should have trusted it from the very beginning," he admitted honestly. "I am only sorry it has taken me this long to recognize your worth, both as my wife and as a genuine partner in managing our shared responsibilities." Over the following weeks, Evelyn found herself increasingly involved in estate decisions, her opinions genuinely valued and incorporated into Alexander's planning. This growing partnership, built on mutual respect rather than mere formality, gradually transformed their marriage into something neither of them had believed possible during those first difficult years of cold distance and mutual isolation. The Dowager Duchess Margaret, visiting again in early winter, observed the transformation with evident satisfaction. "You have finally become the man your father should have raised you to be," she told Alexander privately, pride evident in her voice. "I am proud of you, my son, for finding the courage to change, however difficult that journey must have been." "I could not have managed it without recognizing my own failures clearly," Alexander admitted, "and without Evelyn's patience in allowing me the chance to prove myself worthy of her continued trust." "She has shown remarkable grace," Margaret agreed. "Do not squander it, Alexander. Continue proving yourself worthy, every single day, for as long as you both shall live." As winter deepened around Ashford Manor, the household staff began noticing a genuine warmth settling into the previously cold corridors, laughter echoing through halls that had known only silence for far too long. Evelyn and Alexander had not yet reached the full culmination of their journey toward genuine partnership, but the foundation they had built together, brick by careful brick, had grown sturdy enough to withstand whatever challenges still awaited them, and both found themselves, for the first time in their marriage, genuinely hopeful about the future they were building together. The winter ball at Ashford Manor had always been a grand affair, drawing nobility from across the county to celebrate the season within the estate's finest halls. But this year, as servants prepared the great ballroom with garlands of evergreen and hundreds of glowing candles, Evelyn found herself approaching the event with an anticipation entirely different from previous years. For the first 3 years of her marriage, the winter ball had been an exercise in quiet endurance, standing beside a husband who acknowledged her presence only when propriety absolutely demanded it, spending the evening largely alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of guests. This year, watching Alexander oversee the final preparations with genuine enthusiasm, consulting her preferences at every turn, Evelyn allowed herself, cautiously, to hope for something different. "You look beautiful," Alexander said, finding her in her chambers as she prepared for the evening, his eyes carrying a warmth that had become increasingly familiar over recent months, yet still managed to make her heart flutter each time she witnessed it. "Thank you," Evelyn said, smoothing the deep blue silk of her gown, a color Alexander himself had suggested weeks earlier, remembering her mention of loving the color of the sea she had never seen. "You seem nervous," she observed, noting an unusual tension in his posture. "I have something planned for this evening," Alexander admitted, a hint of vulnerability breaking through his usual composure. "I only hope it proves adequate to express what I have struggled to properly convey these past months." Evelyn studied him curiously but did not press further, sensing his desire for the evening to unfold naturally, rather than through premature explanation. They descended together to the ballroom, arm in arm, presenting a united front to their guests that felt, for the first time in years, entirely genuine rather than performed. The evening proceeded with its usual grandeur, guests dancing beneath glittering chandeliers, conversation flowing easily among the assembled nobility. But Evelyn noticed Alexander remaining close beside her throughout, engaging her in genuine conversation between dances, introducing her to guests with evident pride, rather than the distracted formality he had once displayed. Near midnight, as the orchestra paused between pieces, Alexander unexpectedly requested the room's attention, drawing surprised murmurs from the assembled guests, unaccustomed to such public displays from the typically reserved Duke. "I would like to say a few words," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom, "about my wife, Evelyn." Evelyn felt her breath catch, uncertain what to expect, her heart pounding as every eye in the room turned toward them. "For 3 years," Alexander continued, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability evident in his expression. I failed to see the remarkable woman standing beside me. I allowed old wounds and unfounded fears to blind me to her genuine worth, her kindness, her intelligence, her quiet strength in enduring circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. I am not proud of that failure, but I am deeply grateful that she has given me the chance, these past months, to prove myself worthy of her continued presence in my life. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, guests exchanging surprised glances at this unprecedented public vulnerability from a man known throughout the county for his reserved, guarded nature. "Evelyn," Alexander continued, turning to face her directly, taking her hands gently in his own, "you are not simply my wife in name, as I once cruelly suggested. You are my partner, my equal, and the woman whose kindness and patience have taught me what genuine love truly requires. I love you, Evelyn, completely and without reservation, and I intend to spend the remainder of our lives together, proving myself worthy of that love, every single day." Tears filled Evelyn's eyes as the weight of his public declaration settled fully into her heart, 3 years of loneliness and doubt finally giving way to genuine, overwhelming joy. She had waited so long to be truly seen, truly valued, and here, before their entire community, Alexander had finally offered her exactly that. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, loud enough for those nearest them to hear, drawing warm applause from the assembled guests who had witnessed the remarkable transformation of their Duke and Duchess over recent months. Alexander drew her into a gentle embrace, and as the orchestra resumed playing, they shared their first dance of the evening, not as distant strangers fulfilling social obligation, but as genuine partners, finally united after years of unnecessary distance and isolation. Later that night, as the ball wound to its natural conclusion, and guests began departing into the cold winter evening, Evelyn and Alexander found themselves alone in the quiet garden, snow beginning to fall gently around them, transforming the familiar landscape into something new and beautiful. "Thank you," Evelyn said softly, "for finally seeing me." "I should have seen you from the very beginning," Alexander replied, drawing her closer against the winter chill. "I am only grateful that you gave me the chance to correct that failure, even when I gave you every reason to give up on me entirely." "I nearly did," Evelyn admitted honestly. "But something in me kept hoping, even during the darkest years, that the man I married might still exist somewhere beneath all that coldness." "He does," Alexander said quietly. "And he intends to spend the rest of his life making certain you never again feel invisible in your own home, your own marriage, your own life." They stood together in the falling snow, the manor's lights glowing warmly behind them, a stark contrast to the cold isolation that had once defined their marriage. Evelyn thought of the long road that had brought them here, the loneliness she had endured, the unexpected kindness of a stranger who had helped illuminate her own worth, and the remarkable transformation of a husband who had finally found the courage to confront his own deepest fears. The path ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, as all genuine partnerships inevitably did, but for the first time since her wedding day, Evelyn faced that future with genuine hope rather than resigned endurance. She was no longer the invisible Duchess, forgotten in her own home. She was, finally, completely and unmistakably seen, cherished, and loved, exactly as she had always deserved to be. As the snow continued falling softly around them, Alexander pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, and together they turned back toward the manor, ready to begin the next chapter of a marriage, finally built on the honest foundation of genuine love, mutual respect, and the unwavering commitment neither of them had believed possible only months earlier. The end.